I'm a medical doctor. I graduated from Oxford in 2015 and have worked full-time and then part-time in the UK NHS as a doctor. I also work part-time in research, so I research at the University of Oxford in bioethics and particularly abortion ethics and policy relating to that. So yeah, a good mix of things. Yeah, well, this is a great question and in many ways probably the most popular question people would ask on the question of abortion. What I would say is that it's actually a little bit ambiguous, and to some extent it might be the wrong question to ask, at least because it's a bit vague. What we really want to know is, what are we? What are you? What am I? And we are human beings. We're individual human organisms. We're members of the human family. And so the question isn't necessarily when does life begin, because all sorts of things are alive that don't have moral value, like bacteria or a skin cell of mine. So we want to know, when does something like you or me begin? When does a human being begin? And far from being a religious question or a philosophical question, this is actually just a straightforward question of science. When I was at medical school, if I had to answer this question in an exam, I would say fertilization, and I imagine if I gave any other answer, I would have failed. So it's really something that is a biological question. Biology studies life, that's what the word means. And so this is a question about biology, and biology is very clear on it. There was actually a study a few years ago by a researcher from the University of Chicago, and he thought, well, we do have a load of embryology textbooks and journal articles and everywhere saying a human organism begins to exist at conception or fertilization. But let's codify this. Let's make it really clear that this is what people do actually believe. So he emailed thousands of biologists around the world, and he got 5,000 replies, or 5,500 replies. And he asked them, when does a human organism begin to exist? Is it true to say that at the end of fertilization, a human organism is created? And questions around that theme. And what he found was that 95% of biologists agreed in some form or other that a human organism began at fertilization. And so, although there were 5% who disagreed, likely for political reasons, we probably think, the evidence in science is pretty clear, and there's a pretty unanimous consensus that life begins at fertilization, if that's what we're talking about. That's a great question, and I think it's one that a lot of people kind of come across. I think most people in Europe would say abortion in the first trimester is okay, and abortion in the third trimester is definitely not okay. And people are a bit more split about abortion in the second trimester. So this is really a common view, that there's a moral difference between them. It's not always explained what that difference is. Some people don't really, I guess, think about fetal development and don't have an idea about what changes in the second trimester or the third trimester. Now, of course, there are things that the baby achieves at certain points in development. So at 3 weeks after fertilization, the heart begins beating. At 6 weeks, brain waves are detectable. At 7 weeks, it can hiccup and suck and swallow. At 10 weeks, it's able to feel pain. Later in the pregnancy, they can do all sorts of things. They can remember songs and react if a song is played wrong. They can recognize their mother's voice. They can recognize their mother's accent. There was even a study showing that babies would come out of the womb crying in the particular accent that they had heard in the womb. So French babies came out crying in a French way and German babies came out crying in a German way. I don't know how they judge this, but they're experts and apparently this is a thing. But of course, those are all abilities, and we don't normally judge a person's value by their abilities. If we did that, some of us would be in a lot of trouble. Most of us have very different abilities. Some people can do pretty much anything. You've probably come across those people and hate them. Some people aren't able to do much at all. But we're all committed fundamentally to the conviction that humans are equally valuable regardless of their abilities. And so this is a question not about what can we do or what can we achieve, but what are we? And so when it comes to the question of pregnancy and the unborn child, that's the ultimate question. It's impressive that they can do all of these things, often at an earlier stage than people really give them credit for, but that isn't ultimately what gives them their value. What gives them their value is the fact that they are human beings and they are equal. And so in that respect, whether it's the first trimester or the third trimester, or the first year after birth, or 5 years after birth, or 10 years after birth, the only thing that remains constant is that they are a human being. And so that's what gives these children value. And that value is there from the moment of the beginning of their life. So all of us are committed to the idea of human rights. In the international law, it says very clearly in Article 6 of the ICCPR, every human being has the right to life. And this is something we think is true, and it's something we think is important. And we also have to think about some of the implications of that. And in the same article of international law, it says, this right shall be protected by law. And I think most of us would recognize that if a right, or at least a fundamental right, isn't protected by law, in a way it's useless. If we said of the people who were victims of slavery in America in the 19th century, they have the right to be free, but that's not enshrined in law. It would be a meaningless right in some ways. We need laws not as a way of punishing people or as a way of restricting people from having fun or doing what they want to do, but we need laws to protect the vulnerable. And so the question then is, who is the vulnerable? Who is included in the scope of that? Well, international law says every human being. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think it says every member of the human family. And there have always been attempts to exclude some human beings from that. And what we've seen is that when some human beings are excluded from that legal protection and from that ethical protection, the consequences are devastating. When slavery was outlawed in the US, it wasn't a case of the government trying to control slave owners or undermine them or take away their rights, although that's how they saw it. It was a question of the government trying to uphold the most fundamental protections and most fundamental rights of vulnerable human beings. Now, what I'm not doing here is comparing people having abortions and slave owners as if they're morally equivalent. I'm not saying that at all. There are clearly some women who have abortions in very desperate situations where it's entirely understandable why they would choose to do that. In the case of slavery, it's much less easy to understand why someone would enslave another human being for profit or for help around the house or for far more trivial reasons. But still, the underlying reality is the same, which is that this is a human being, a vulnerable human being, that needs protection. And sometimes protecting human beings means doing things that make life temporarily more difficult for other people. But what we come to realize is that after time, although there might be a temporary reluctance or a temporary distress, actually protecting the rights of human beings is the right thing to do, and people come around to it. This is something we see in the case of abortion. There's a recent study called the Turnaway Study, which is actually a study done by advocates of abortion who think that abortion is a human right and is healthcare and needs to be provided and needs to be legally accessible. And they studied, as a way of advocating for this, women who were denied abortions in the US. And what they found is that although quite a few women were distressed at being denied an abortion in the US, within just a week of being denied an abortion, nearly half of them no longer wished they could have an abortion. They were glad and relieved that they were continuing the pregnancy. By 5 years, by the time of the child's 5th birthday, 98% of the women said they were glad that they had the baby and happy that they had the baby, even though a fair number of them were distressed at initially being denied an abortion. And so I'm not saying that going through a pregnancy is always easy, certainly it's not, and there are some people who would find that process immensely difficult, though actually the majority come to terms with it very quickly. But my point is that firstly, we have to uphold the legal rights of the most vulnerable human beings. And secondly, that when we do that, when unborn children are protected, their mothers are also protected as well. And when you ask them eventually, are you glad that this situation happened? They say yes. 98% said they were happy that they had their baby. And that only came about because their baby's rights were protected in law. So I've been a doctor for 6 years, and most of my work is not related to abortion in the clinical space, though most of my academic work is related to abortion. And over that time I've come across a number of women who have had abortions or are considering abortions, and so on. And I think the first thing that we have to say, which is of paramount importance, is that women are different, and no two women will have the same reaction, though many will have similar responses. I've had a woman who came into my office when I was working in general practice who said that she was depressed, she was suicidal, she had drug addictions, and she was struggling to take care of her child. And I didn't ask her anything kind of probing, I didn't ask any leading questions, I simply said, as I ordinarily would, is there anything that you think triggered these sorts of difficulties that you've been going through, any trauma or anything like that? And she said, she volunteered the fact that it was due to the abortion that she had had many years previously. And I asked her, did anyone warn you that you can have very serious mental health implications from an abortion? And she said, no, no one warned me. Now, this was a simple anecdote in my experience, and I haven't come across many in my own experience who have opened up in that way to me. And that's partly because I work in a specialty that doesn't generally deal with these sorts of issues. But what I have done is looked at the academic research, which is a much more scientific way of gathering those women's stories and seeing what they say on average, or seeing how many people say one thing and how many people say another thing. Now, what you'll often hear is that most women who have an abortion feel relieved, and that relief is the most common feeling after an abortion. And in the early stages after an abortion, this is absolutely true. And this is easy to imagine. If you have an abortion when you had a very unintended and unwanted pregnancy, having the abortion will make you feel a relief that at least you don't have to go through this life-changing experience, and you can put that aside and forget about it. But that doesn't tell the whole picture, because also the large majority of women say that they feel guilt after an abortion. About a third say that they feel very much guilt, and a third say they feel a significant amount of guilt. About the same is true for sorrow and sadness. Most women say they feel these things after an abortion. And so the most common reaction after an abortion actually is a mix of feelings. You get some positive feelings like relief, which is generally quite temporary and subsides over time. And you also get significant negative feelings. There's one study by one of the leading researchers who supports abortion, which found that over time, negative feelings about the abortion increase and positive feelings decrease. So actually, by only asking women a year after their abortion how they feel, you might not capture the woman who 10 years down the line really comes to regret it and really has significant pain as a result of it. And so we have to understand women on a case-by-case basis and listen to their stories. Every woman should be allowed to tell their own story in their own voice. But what I would say is that this idea that women simply just feel relief after an abortion is nothing like the whole story, and actually marginalizes and silences the large majority of women who also want to tell stories of their grief or of the guilt. And this is critically important because we want to support those women and we want to help them heal and understand that there is an opportunity for healing after an abortion. So the standard line that you will hear on abortion and mental health is that there's no evidence, or there's insufficient evidence to show that abortion causes mental health problems. Now, I think there's actually a lot more evidence than that, and I've actually just written a paper which is being published on this topic. The first thing I'd say is that it's uncontroversial that some women have very significant mental health problems as a result of their abortion. In one study by one of the leading pro-abortion researchers, they found that 1.5% of women who had an abortion had abortion-specific post-traumatic stress disorder. Now that sounds like a very small percentage, but when you imagine in the US there are 1 million abortions every year, that means about 15,000 women will have abortion-specific post-traumatic stress disorder, an extremely distressing and difficult condition to deal with. So we know that some women have mental health difficulties, and often very severe mental health difficulties, as a result of their abortion, and no one disputes that. The more controversial question is, what is the average rate of mental health disorder after abortion compared with completing an unwanted pregnancy? Now, what surprises many people is that there's actually a fair consensus on this question as well. There's pretty much a consensus that the rate of anxiety after an abortion is higher than the rate of anxiety after completing an unwanted pregnancy, even when you take into account the woman's previous mental health, her socioeconomic status, any domestic abuse, her age, and all those other factors. When you keep them constant, women having abortions still have higher anxiety than women who complete an unwanted pregnancy. And the more abortions a woman has, the more that link becomes clear. And so it seems very clear that there is a causal relationship. Likewise, we know, and this is uncontroversial, that suicide is a condition which pregnancy protects very strongly against. Pregnancy and childbirth and having children are some of the strongest protective factors against suicide. Now, clearly abortion removes that protective effect, but it also seems to do more than that. Women who have abortions, even when you compare them with women who never get pregnant and women who continue an unwanted pregnancy, when you take into account all of those other factors, you still find that women who have abortions have higher suicide rates. Now, this is important because suicide is the leading cause of maternal death in many developed countries. And the evidence is now pretty clear that there's a causal link between abortion and suicide. And the best studies in existence, which are authored by pro-choice researchers, the work of David Ferguson from New Zealand, clearly says that abortion is linked with suicide, and this is probably a causal relationship. So this idea that the link between abortion and mental health has been debunked or refuted really doesn't stand up to what the latest science shows. And so anyone who is maybe tempted to think that way, I really think should engage with the latest science on this question and the best science on this question. And they should come to realise that abortion really is linked with significant mental health problems. Yes, so there are a couple of other things. So one is the effect of abortion on women's alcohol and substance misuse. Now, we know again that the best quality studies on this show a very clear association and a very big association. So women who have abortions are many, many times more likely to abuse alcohol or drugs than women who continue an unwanted pregnancy. Part of this is again because there is a well-documented and uncontroversial evidence base showing that when you have a child and when you become pregnant, you stop smoking. Obviously that's not true in every case, but it is true in many cases. And when you have a child, you have that responsibility, which gives you an incentive not to use drugs or alcohol in ways which are harmful. We also know that abortion is linked with preterm birth. Now, preterm birth is difficult to understand for people who haven't been through it and recognise the consequences of it, but it's associated with really significant outcomes for the child and consequent distress and difficulty for the parents in many cases. In fact, premature birth is the leading cause of infant death worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. And the research linking preterm birth with abortion is pretty much uncontroversial. Everyone agrees that there is an association. And although some people will go so far as to say we don't know what the causal relationship is, that is about as far as anyone would go. So the debate really is this a causal relationship, or is there insufficient evidence either way? I don't think anyone says with confidence that there is no causal relationship. And my view is that the evidence is pretty clear that there is a causal relationship. And in fact, even the organizations which are skeptical about that say that probably the main theory of why that is because of the abortion causing trauma to the cervix and causing preterm birth in future. So that's another well-documented effect of abortion on women. I would say firstly that I think in a way they're on the right lines, which is that they're not disputing that the unborn child is a human being, and they're not disputing that it's alive, because that's a mistake that I think many people make. They will say, we don't know when life begins, we don't know if it's alive, we don't know when it becomes a human. All of those questions are settled by biology. We know when it's a human being, we know when its life begins, and so on. But this person who would ask this question understands that there's maybe a difference between a human being and a person. And so some people want to say that although the unborn child is a human being, it's not a person. And what they mean by that is, although biologically it's a human being and it's a member of the human species, morally it doesn't have the attributes needed to become a person with full moral status, a person that has rights that we need to respect. So in the same way that there are human cells which are not persons, they would say that there are human beings which are not persons, and they don't have full moral status. What I would say to that is, in order to make that distinction, you have to distinguish between human beings based on some sort of ability. You have to say that a human becomes a person when they are self-conscious or when they're rational. And the problem with doing that, as philosophers from both sides of this debate recognize, is that once you put the standard for being a person that high, not only do you exclude unborn children, you also exclude newborn babies, you also exclude toddlers, and you also exclude many mentally disabled people who may not have the mental skills of other people. And what they've said is that if you support abortion because the fetus is not a person, you also have to support infanticide or euthanasia for people who are sufficiently mentally disabled. And these are ideas which I think most of us would find very worrying and sinister, the idea that we can end the life of newborn babies or toddlers simply because they don't have the same mental skills that adults have. And of course that cuts against human equality very fundamentally. If we say that human equality is based on a mental capacity, then what about people with different levels of mental ability? They must have different levels of value. They can't be equal. And so once you get into talking about personhood and distinguishing that from human being, you have to say that we are no longer equal as a family of humans. You have to say that some people are worth more than others and that our value depends on our ability. Ultimately, the only thing that we all have in common is the fact that we are human beings. And so therefore it makes sense that the only plausible basis for human equality is the fact that we are human beings. And if that's true, then we have to include the unborn child as part of that, because we are people who want to follow the science and want to follow human rights wherever they lead us. It's a great question, and it's a question that I think in many cases comes from a real place of compassion and empathy for women. And for that reason, many people who personally oppose abortion are often tempted to say abortion should be allowed so that we can save lives of women. Now, there are a couple of assumptions that this argument makes. The first is that limiting abortion or protecting the unborn child doesn't do anything to prevent abortions. Now, we know from decades of empirical research that that is completely false. There's no evidence for it whatsoever, and there is a mountain of evidence against it. We know that laws that protect people do work, and that's true in the case of abortion as well. And you can point to a number of examples for that. A second assumption that this argument makes is that there are large numbers of women who die from illegal abortion. Now, one of the reasons this is problematic is because statistics on this question usually link together induced abortion, which we know as abortion, and spontaneous abortion, which is a miscarriage. And so women who have a spontaneous abortion, a miscarriage, and as a result bleed or get an infection and die as a result, will be attributed to deaths from induced abortion. And so the numbers of women who die from induced abortion are massively inflated in the statistics. And we can show that most of the statistics on this question massively exaggerate the number of women who die from illegal abortion, sometimes by a factor of 100 or even more. Now, the third assumption this makes is that legalizing abortion will save those few women who do die from illegal abortions. But the evidence simply doesn't support that. So in pro-life countries that protect unborn babies and have very good healthcare, like Poland and Malta, they have the lowest maternal mortality rates in the entire world, far lower than in most of Western Europe. And likewise, in countries that have legalized abortion but have significantly worse healthcare, they still have large numbers of women dying from illegal abortions in Zambia or India or Mozambique or Ethiopia or South Africa. And so what this shows is that when women die from illegal abortion, it is more a result of the healthcare system and the lack of access to emergency services than anything to do with the abortion law itself. In fact, when you look at the impact of changing the abortion law, you find that there's no evidence that maternal mortality decreases as a result. Sometimes when you make abortion illegal, like in Chile or Poland, maternal mortality continues to decrease and fewer women die from abortions because that's just the natural trend. By contrast, in some countries like Ethiopia, when you legalize abortion, not only does the number of legal abortions increase, and therefore you expose more women to a risk, the number of illegal abortions also increased. So it's not that legalizing abortion suddenly gets rid of illegal abortion. In fact, in many countries, it makes the problem of illegal abortion even worse. And so what you find in Ethiopia is that when the law was changed, the number of severe complications from abortion actually increased. And so the problem of illegal abortion got worse when abortion was legalized. And there are a number of other similar examples. But for all those reasons, I'd say that laws protecting the unborn child are also laws protecting the unborn child's mother. And that should be our central priority and focus, protecting them both. And that is what countries like Poland and Malta have been able to do. They are at the forefront of the world in saving women during pregnancy. And that is because they have laws which uphold the value of both the mother and the unborn child. Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is that it shouldn't really be a question of religion or politics. In the political case, as late as the 1980s, Democrats and Republicans had the same views on abortion among the population. The party positions were very different, but Republicans and Democrats in the late 1980s were just as likely to be pro-life or pro-choice as each other. And that shows how much politics has polarized things. It doesn't have to be that way. You can be a progressive, left-leaning person who is pro-life, and actually this is where I came from myself. I was someone who was always advocating for the poor and who was interested in social justice, defending the most vulnerable. And it's precisely because I wanted to defend the most vulnerable that I saw the vulnerable in the unborn child and realized this was another person that I had to add to my list of marginalized human beings that need protection and need a voice. On the other hand, I would say it shouldn't necessarily be a religious issue either. I actually came to my views on abortion partly because, or actually mostly because I thought that the philosophical arguments and the medical arguments pointed that way. It became clear that this was an unborn child, not a ball of cells or a piece of tissue, and this was from studying medicine at Oxford. It wasn't from reading the Bible or anything like that. And so what I would say is that anyone can be pro-life. No matter your political views, no matter your religious views, anyone can and should be pro-life because the science supports it and because it's a fundamental question of human rights and human equality and a question that science can answer. That said, I think Christians can make an incredible contribution on this debate, and they have made a unique contribution through history. Many people think that if we just got the church out of politics, and if we just got rid of the Christian history and erased all the contributions Christianity made, we could have a nice, liberal, democratic society that upheld the rights of the most vulnerable. But historically, that's not how it worked. Before Christianity, you had not only abortion, but infanticide, and this was normally for women or for girls and for disabled people. And it's only because of Christianity, which said, this is a human being, this is a human life, life begins at conception, that we ever got rid of infanticide in the first place. And so Christianity contributed not only to the saving of newborn babies, it contributed to a culture which began to realize the value of women and disabled people in the same way. And now obviously it didn't, Christianity didn't manage to fully uphold the values of women throughout much of its history, but it pointed in the right direction and it made early steps towards that and revolutionized the culture. And so I would say, be careful before you try to erase the Christian heritage on the beginning of life, because if you do that, we will be back at infanticide quicker than you think. And in some countries like the Netherlands, that has already started. Christians also at the same time didn't just say, this is a baby and a child that needs protection. Christians always married that with a radical concern for the mother. And this comes from the overwhelming tradition throughout the Bible, through the Old Testament and the New Testament, through the history of Judaism and early Christianity, of caring for the orphan and the widow. And those two were always put together. Now in those times, those two would be put together often because a man had died in combat or from an infection or from whatever else. In our time, we have orphans and widows everywhere, not because the man has died, but because the man has chosen to abdicate their responsibility to their partner and to their child. And Christianity, therefore, in the 21st century is dealing with the same situation with a radical concern for orphans and widows. But these are orphans and widows not of a dead father, but of an absent father. And what Christianity did from the very beginning was it said, we will look after those babies. So the babies that were left outside by parents in the Roman Empire, Christians would go and look for them. They would go to the rubbish dumps, they would go to the marketplace and look for babies. And they would take them in and they would look after them. And they would make sure that any woman they came across who was in need would be provided for. And so that's the call of Christians in the 21st century, to reach the orphans and widows who have often been left there by an absent man who has abdicated their responsibility. So Christians should be advocating for the unborn child, advocating for the woman, advocating to the man that he needs to be there to provide for his family, and ultimately supporting them, being the hands and feet of Jesus, working for them, working with them to show them that they are not alone and that the church is behind them so that they never feel they have to have an abortion because of any financial or other need. There will always be the church there to look out for them and to look after them with money, with support, with accommodation, and ultimately with friendship, because that is the thing that people most need in these situations. And so that is the call for Christians today.